It's sometimes been claimed, that Marxism has neglected the issue of culture, which I think is true in one sense, but not in another. I take it, by the way, I'm allowed from time to time a mild criticism of Marxism without, some SWP heavy frog marching me, my arm twisted up my back, out to the exit. Notice how you talk to Marxists, and of course I'm one of the tribe, and they say, well, everything is open to criticism, and you say, all right, mention 5 major criticisms of Marx, and they begin to look rather indignant. Yes. Ironically, the kind of culture that Marxism certainly hasn't ignored, strangely in a way, is high culture. I mean, there are Marxist works galore on Shakespeare and Schoenberg and Shostakovich and Rembrandt and Goethe and Dickens and so on. And those figures like that have not only been of interest to Marxist academics. In Victorian times, so the labour historians tell us, some women who worked in the Lancashire cotton mills actually used to get up an hour before work to read Shakespeare together. And that was incredibly early. I mean, almost as early as Hillary Clinton's power breakfasts, or indeed almost the time George Bush goes to bed. There are certain postmodern critics around today who would no doubt tell those women that they were wasting their time with a dead, white, conservative male. But the truth, of course, is that there is no more honourable tradition in this society than the efforts of working men and women to acquire a spot of culture or education for themselves in lives blighted by fatigue and poverty. No more honourable tradition. They are surely the true culture heroes to be revered, not the late Michael Jackson, much to be lamented, though he is. I mean, his life, not his death. Lamented in the sense of lamentable. Yet there's another sense of culture which I think Marxism hasn't paid that much attention to, which is at least as important as the high sense of culture. I mean culture in the familiar, broader sense of a way of life, of culture as language, tradition, belonging, symbol, identity, belief, kinship, and so on. Culture in that broader sense, if you like, in that more anthropological rather than artistic sense of the word, culture in that sense could be briefly defined as what people are prepared to kill for, or if you like, die for. It actually cuts that deep, which isn't true of Shakespeare and Shostakovich. I mean, not many people are prepared to die or kill for them, apart from a few seriously weird types hiding out in caves, too shamefaced to come out and confront the rest of us. Culture in that broader sense, in that sense of a way of life, a way of belonging, a tradition, a heritage, a legacy, an identity. Culture in that sense is a site of conflict and not of consensus. And that is one crucial distinction, I think, there are many others, between those two meanings of culture. There are hundreds of meanings of culture, but between those two. Because the point about high culture is that it tends to be valued not only in itself, but because it supposedly distills the shared values of civilization. It's a kind of conveniently portable version of the universal or fundamental values we're supposed to live by. It's a place where we can all supposedly converge in our simple, basic humanity. It's a living symbol of that simple, basic humanity, irrespective of differences of class or gender or ethnicity and so on. That idea of culture as embodying a kind of universal humanity was, of course, in its time, in the time of the great bourgeois Enlightenment, a thoroughly progressive, indeed in a sense revolutionary idea. But culture in that sense is, if you like, a solution, or intended as a solution to social conflicts, whereas culture in the broader sense, roughly speaking, culture as identity, is riven with conflicts from end to end. So that's one difference between them. What's happened in our time, vitally and quite dramatically, is that culture then has shifted over from being part of the solution to being part of the problem. For the women's movement, or the gay, or the ethnic communities, culture in that second sense, culture in the sense of speech, of identity, tradition, custom, experience, and so on, is the very language in which political demands are framed, the very language in which they're articulated, so you can make no simple distinction there between culture and politics. Culture is certainly no longer, as it so often is in middle-class society, a kind of optional extra, a bit of decorative window dressing, a spot of icing on the political or economic cake. Culture, in that broad sense, culture as identity, was, of course, absolutely central to the single most wildly successful revolutionary movement of modern times, the current of revolutionary nationalism, which transformed the globe in the middle decades of the last century. I wonder if the comrade on the door could just quieten those guys down. By any method you choose. Now, what I've just described, culture as being in that sense the very language of political demands, isn't so true, note, of the class struggle. There's a difference there, a different role, a different status for culture. Culture in the sense of a specific way of life, a form of identity, a form of belonging, is less important, not non-important, but less important when you're dealing primarily with material, economic, political issues, when what's at stake are material interests rather than identity, and when the movements in question, by their very nature, cut across differences of identity, of genders, of ethnicities, and so on, because its members are supposed to be citizens of the world first, and members of a local culture quite a long way second. And one key political problem in our time, is how we articulate those two things together. Member of a world, citizen of the world, or world global community, and also belonging to a local culture. In fact, socialist internationalism can act as a check to the excesses of too heavy an emphasis upon particularity, particular cultures, to what Raymond Williams once called a militant particularism, in which society fragments into lots of self-isolating identity groups who overrate the centrality of culture. It's possible to overrate culture just as it is to underrate it. In fact, it's one of those concepts which is very hard to get into focus, very hard to keep in proportion, neither to overestimate nor to underplay it. In that sense, it resembles nothing so much as sex. And that's the only bit of this lecture you'll remember in 2 weeks' time. If, for example, postmodernism vastly overrates the importance, the status of culture, so interestingly does Al-Qaeda. Al-Qaeda, which in a typically culturalist way, all fundamentalism is culturalist because it thinks that what matters deeply, fundamentally, are not material interests, but values, beliefs, faith, ideology, and so on. I suppose it's materialism which tries to keep an uneasy balance here by saying that culture is very important, but it's not in the end where it's at. And that cuts deeply against the grain of a culturalist epoch like our own. Take, for example, the idea of British values. Now, the only thing wrong with championing British values is that there aren't any. Just as there aren't any Portuguese or Slovenian or Malaysian values. I mean, nations may have different customs and traditions, to be sure, but none of them has a monopoly on justice or fairness or compassion or moral decency, let alone the British. Values like that, as socialism has rightly insisted, don't vary with the colour of your skin or with the nature of your anatomy. Socialists have insisted on the globally shared values of that kind, and that's how we're indebted to the great revolutionary bourgeois Enlightenment, in which local cultures or specific identities quite often have to take a back seat. But we need to remember also that if culture is as important as it is, I mean culture in that broader sense, it's because, among other things, it's where power, political power, is able to bed itself down. Without culture in that sense of lived, daily, routine experience, habits and customs and values as spontaneous to us as breathing, without that, power is powerless to bed itself down, to interweave itself with the intimate experience of people, and that is the only way in which the law of authority will in the end survive. Only by otherwise it's too abstract, it's too aloof. It has to sink its roots into the experience of everyday life, call that culture if you want, if it's to be successful. That's one reason, incidentally, why multiculturalism, so-called, poses such a problem to our rulers. The problem being that it means that the same political power has to bed itself down in different kinds of culture, in a range of diverse cultures, whereas really would prefer a much tighter kind of cultural consensus to be effective. Think, for example, as far as culture goes, of the transnational corporations. In a sense, you might say what's striking about them is they are utterly cultureless. I mean, they don't belong anywhere, they have no affections or affinities, they're indifferent to specific communities, specific identities, historical legacies, and so on. Yet, of course, they're smart enough to know that culture matters and that they need culture. They need to appeal to the way people do things in, Chittagong rather than in Chelsea, or in Lagos rather than in London. The fact that these appeals are entirely bogus doesn't make them any less significant. Capitalism is a global phenomenon which can only operate through the culturally particular, because that's where all men and women, by the very fact of being material animals, bodies extended in space, actually are. We are locational beings in that sense. We are, by our very bodiliness, local, as it were, cultural, regional beings, though, by virtue of our language, we are potentially universal beings. And that contradiction is often very hard for us to manage, so that's a different story. The fact then is that capitalism needs culture in that sense at the same time as it tends quite ruthlessly to undermine the very local resources, cultural resources, from which it seeks to draw some of its power and authority. It needs culture, but it scuppers it at the same time. But at the same time, socialist internationalism can be too abstract as well, just like transnationals, unless it too engages with men and women where they are, with culture in that sense of the word. In fact, one of the great achievements, to my mind, of Marx, and one of the most excellent reasons for being a Marxist, quite apart from just agreeably annoying people that you don't like at parties and so on, one of the excellent achievements of Marx, he had some major flaws as well, but I'm not allowed to talk about those, was, and I'm sorry to put this so abstractly, the way that he unites good old Enlightenment rationalism with good old romantic humanism. Now, some comrade will stand up at the back at the end, I'll tell you now, and say, what's that got to do with the war in Afghanistan? Quite a lot, actually. On the one hand, Marx is a good old-fashioned Enlightenment thinker who believes in universality. On the other hand, he's a good old romantic who believes profoundly in the concrete and the tangible, in the sensuously particular and the specific. That's one reason he hates the commodity form so much, because it rides roughshod over sensuous particularity, or use value, as he calls it. What that means, politically speaking, I suppose, is that Marx believes in civilization in the sense of universal reason, and culture in the sense of historically concrete forms of life at one and the same time. And that is part of the power, I think, of his work. What this means politically is that socialists aim for a new kind of global or international order which is properly universal in the sense of one in which everybody has to be in on the arguments regardless of their specific differences. That's the progressive moment in bourgeois enlightenment, yet at the same time that order can only work if it works in and through individual particularity, individual specificity, fully takes account of it rather than simply bypassing the cultural specific in the name of the universal, which is the, as it were, bad side of bourgeois enlightenment. Now, the traditional opposite of civilization is usually thought to be barbarism, and the difference between bourgeois and socialist thought, as far as that one goes, is that essentially middle class thought imagines civilization and barbarism to be sequential. That's to say, first you have barbarism, and then you painfully and laboriously dredge from it a civilization which is always sickeningly in danger of sliding back into it. You put the Dark Ages behind you, and you steam cheerfully forward into a glorious future. Whereas socialists see the relation between barbarism and civilization not as sequential, but as synchronic, that's to say, cheek by jowl, simultaneous, coexisting, as close as the two sides of a piece of paper. Every triumph of civilization has been paid for in the waste and toil, in the wretchedness and exhaustion of the people, the working people who have created it. Modern civilization is, for Marx, on the one hand, an exhilarating tale of science, political freedom, social emancipation, democracy, civil rights, the flourishing of the arts, and at the same time, and inseparably, one long, unbroken nightmare. Yes. I don't know of any other body of thought that says those two things together, yes, as it were, out of both sides of its mouth. Moreover, that not just there's the one thing and there happens to be another thing, but that those two things are actually interlocked. Those two aspects are inseparable. In our own time, however, not least since 9/11, a new kind of contrast has begun to emerge, not so much between the traditional one between civilization and barbarism, but, you might say, between civilization and culture. In this view, the civilized world is characterized by reason, individualism, autonomy, irony, universal values and material prosperity, while the world of culture is a world of tribal loyalties, unreasoned convictions, unquestioned identities, collectivity rather than individualism, faith rather than reason, mythology rather than history. You will not be too surprised to hear that we have civilization and they have culture. Civilization versus culture is a new way of, a recently emergent way, you might say, of mapping the axis between West and East, or if you like, between North and South. It's a new ideological technique for carving up the globe, culturally speaking. What we have with people like Richard Dawkins, Christopher Hitchens, Martin Amis, Salman Rushdie, and a number of other liberal middle-class worthies, Ian McEwan as a kind of uneasy fellow traveller with this group, is a new form of cultural supremacism, racist supremacism not being too acceptable in Hampstead or North Oxford, in which, in an astonishing irony, in a most grotesque irony, it is now the very civilized liberal guardians of the flame of diversity and tolerance and civility and cross-cultural understanding who, in their panic-stricken rush after 9/11, are stridently contrasting the progress and civility of the West with the benightedness and cultural barbarism of the East. Doing this, of course, at the very time when the Western military are burning Muslim children alive. Which might raise some questions as to who the barbarians are here. And this surely is one reason why Gott has suddenly perked up his unaccustomed head again. Why is everybody talking, including me, talking about God at a time when we all thought, he'd retired, embittered and anguished from the historical scene he'd created, determined never to start it again, I think what the God debate is really about is that God is no longer, the sort of patriotic, short-haired, blue-blazered, country club, suburban God of America, but a wrathful, dark-skinned, barbarous, fanatical God who now threatens everything the West holds dear. God himself has shifted from one side to the other. So that the assault on religion then is not just a proper objection to Islamist murderers, not just that, which is utterly proper objection as to any fundamentalist murderers, whether they're Texan or Taliban, but a thinly coded rejection of the Islamic world as a whole, on the part, as I say, of some of the most enlightened, progressive, metropolitan literati of our time, a kind of cultural or intellectual hegemony to accompany the West's neo-imperialist agenda. Quite straight, with deep sadness. But I have to confess that Christopher Hitchens and I, as members of the International Socialists, forerunners to the Socialist Workers' Party, once used to leaflet the Cowley car plant in Oxford together, but he has matured, he has left these childish baubles behind him, he's gone on to higher things, he's become a fully paid-up citizen of Babylon, made his peace with the Pentagon, and I remain stuck in my infantile ways, churlishly refusing to accept the fact that the world has changed and is stuck with my leftism like a toddler with his blanket. The contradiction then is that capitalism can't really get on with culture, but it can't do without it. It's too simple simply to say it's Philistine. Yes, it may well be, but in a wider sense of the word culture, as that which beds power down, it vitally needs it as well. And it can't really escape from that contradiction. In a sense, that's also true, however, I'll end by saying this, of culture in the narrower aesthetic or artistic sense as well. Oh, sure, capitalism can get on with Picasso and Matisse in the sense of hanging them in the lobbies of its banks as an opulent status symbol. What it really can't stomach, however, what makes it deeply disquiet, is the scandal of an activity, art or culture, which seems to be performed entirely for its own sake, which exists just for the hell of it, just for its own self-delight, which has no obvious utility, which is therefore simply by existing represents a critique of a social order dominated by utility, by exchange value, and by a ruthlessly instrumentalist form of reason. Ironically then, and this was the insight of the great modernists of the 20th century, it's by being a thing in itself, by being wholly itself, that art is most profoundly political, not necessarily by portraying coal mines or imperial wars or whatever. Marx believed that men and women would only be truly free once they could produce for the sake of it, not for profit, not for utility, not for survival. Yes? That is, if you like, Marx's notion of communism, where we will create simply for the hell of it, simply for the delight of it, as great socialists like Oscar Wilde, socialist and aesthete, not accidentally understood. And what prefigures that state of affairs in contemporary class-ridden society is, of all things, of all apparently useless things, artistic culture. Prefigures it precisely because it is useless. Marx looks forward to a time in which men and women also, in which we will be able to live as far as possible simply for the delight of it, not to have to justify our existences before some grim hatchet-faced tribunal of utility or history or Geist or productivity or will, but simply to unfold our powers and capacities, and this is deeply Marx's ethics, which is also politics, to unfold our powers and capacities simply for the pleasure and delight of that. Where we too will be able to live with glorious pointlessness rather than as objects or functions or instruments. Freud once wrote famously that where id was, there shall ego be. That was the slogan of his campaign. We might equally say with Marx, where art was, there shall humanity be. And if that isn't a triumphal flourish on which to end, I don't know what is. In a moment of madness, I'm going to try to respond to all of the questions. I'll probably be carried away at the end, frothing at the mouth and gesticulating wildly. Salman Rushdie, remember that? That's where we began. Yes, Rushdie, of course, changed politically both after the fatwa and after 9/11. He said recently he was further now from politics than he's ever been in his life. And this at a time when his own people are under more savage attack than at any time, probably in his own life. I think that Edward Said, I greatly admire and respect Edward Said, who's a friend of mine. I think he was the right kind of post-colonialist in that he talked about concrete political realities and not just about texts and discourses. On the other hand, I was never really clear, having known Edward for about 20 years, whether he was a socialist or not. It doesn't really come through in his writing, and I think there are important sort of absences there that need filling out. On the question of high and low art, yes, that distinction itself is being progressively eroded, and that's a good thing in one sense, but don't forget what's also eroding it is postmodernism. Postmodernism, among other things, transgresses the traditional frontier between high and low, and not always, as it were, to the good. Because don't forget, certain kinds of high art, from Baudelaire onwards, can actually be more radical than certain kinds of so-called popular art produced by an enormous capitalist commercial machine. Let's, while remembering the authentic nature, the authentic radicalism of some kinds of popular culture, let's not idealize in a populist manner popular culture, which of course is thoroughly integrated into general commodity production. But it's true also that the axis high and low doesn't coincide with the axis good and bad. Yeah? Think of whole genres like, say, film, like science fiction, popular genres that produce magnificent works. And incidentally, as far as the comrade who talked about great literature and so on goes, yes, but don't forget, evaluation is part of everyday life. Yeah? We evaluate all the time. And there's no reason why we should be puritanical about not evaluating art. Just to remember that those axes don't coincide. Neither does the axis radical or conservative coincide with the high or low, as I just said. So it's a much more complex situation in that sense than, as it were, just backing one horse against the other. As Adorno famously said, both high and popular art are torn halves of an integral freedom to which they do not add up. The contradiction itself is very interesting there, I think. Trotsky, Gareth raised the question of Trotsky, and he's quite right that I ought to, in my work, revisit Trotsky, not least Gareth, because, of course, Trotsky answers to both senses of culture I spoke about, doesn't he? He's consumingly interested in, as it were, high culture in the great Russian poetic tradition. He's also, and indeed in the avant-garde, he's also concerned with culture as everyday life. He absolutely draws those two. I would want to be critical of him here and there. I think he ends Literature and Revolution with far too idealist and utopian a notion of human powers, which gets us all a bad name. I think that he has to be more, submit to material limit rather more. But the fact that Trotsky absolutely champions the avant-garde in the teeth of a Philistine Stalinist artistic policy is to his undying credit. The question about the commodification of art, which the avant-garde, among other movements, transgressive movements, has tried to prevent or to rupture, let me be fairly pessimistic there on the one hand. I think the answer to what can't be commodified artistically is nothing. Nothing is not in principle commodifiable. But that's not the whole story. The avant-gardes, the traditional, the great futurist and Bolshevik avant-garde, and then later the avant-garde of the Weimar Republic, Brecht and so on, they didn't fail because they were commodified. They didn't even fail because they ran out of artistic inspiration. They failed because they were smashed firstly by Stalinism and then by fascism. They failed for political reasons. And the avant-garde, at least the cannier members of it, understood very well, I think, that unless an avant-garde cultural movement is rooted in a mass political movement, it hasn't in the end a hope in hell. Yeah? They were materialist enough to know that they themselves could not go it alone. So that's something that I suppose we have to remember. On the question of art for art's sake, I think I absolutely agree that that's not and should not be the only form of art that we champion or pursue. More explicitly, political forms of art, committed forms of art are for me absolutely indispensable. I'm a pluralist as far as forms of art on the left goes. Avant-garde, realist, committed, aesthetic, they can all have good political effects. It's just that I think the left has dreadfully tended to caricature art for art's sake as some mere languid upper-class aestheticism. It absolutely has missed, on the whole, the radical charge or potential of that. We have to avoid, in art as in other aspects, a left utilitarianism which simply mirrors the right utilitarianism that we're trying to oppose. On the question the comrade raised about culture and ideology, very complex. I think, let me just say this, culture I think is the broader term. Not everything is ideological. Any word that means everything means nothing. Not everything is political. Yeah? Ideology, for me, means those bits and pieces of culture which hook up to power. Those practices, forms of speech, forms of discourse, ideas, which actually have a fairly direct relationship to power of some kind. So ideology is, for me, the narrower term. Not all culture is ideological. Some culture can even be utopian. Dawkins and Hitchens seem to me absolutely right, and to be congratulated for their brave stance against the more disgustingly oppressive and reactionary aspects of religion. I speak as somebody who has pursued both men ruthlessly through the press and elsewhere, yes. But one has to be about this as everything. One has to make a dialectical assessment, and that is surely the word, isn't it, the relevant word, when we talk about being on the one hand critical and being on the other hand supportive. There's no contradiction in that. It's what Marx and socialists feel about bourgeois society. You know, sometimes rather tenderfoot socialists think the bourgeois tradition is simply something to be written off, forgetting that Marx had undying praise for the bourgeoisie as the most revolutionary class in history, which some Marxists oddly find embarrassing. But unless we have a positive as well as critical assessment, unless socialism learns from as well as being a critique of the great civilization it receives, it's not going to be, I just got a note saying, shut the something up. I don't know what that is. I can't read the third word there. All right, and let me just finish then, if I may. I think I tried to cover as many things as possible, yes, by saying that, well, I'm very pleased about what the comrade said about my delivery. I'm very flattered by that. I spend hours in front of the mirror. I think that the answer is, I also can't stand people who read their papers as though they've never seen them before. You know, or as though they're written in Portuguese and they're translating as they go along. You know, I suppose I used to be a bit of an actor in an amateur kind of way, and I suppose I'm just a frustrated actor. But I do think that a good lecture should be a performance. Yes, and you shouldn't be afraid of showmanship. Too much showmanship is boring and so on, but you shouldn't be too afraid of that. As for the comrade who had another view, you know, and I'm going to be dialectically and impeccably even-handed here, who couldn't understand me, I wonder what she thinks about Marx. You know, she tried Capital Volume 3, you know, supposed to be related to everyday life, but my goodness, it takes a few cups of black coffee to get through it, you know. I'll just respond to her by telling a little story. I once years and years ago, spoke to a worker writers group. I was involved in what was then known as the Worker Writers Association, of local groups of working people writing mostly autobiographies. And they asked me to speak, the Bristol group, I think it was, asked me to speak on the idea of autobiography. I tried to keep it as simple as I could, without being patronising or condescending. And there was an old lady of, I think she was 78, she was blind. She was at the back. She went on, Joyce, her name was, she went on to produce a magnificent autobiography, which was actually published and which I had the honour of writing a preface to. Anyway, she was a fierce old lady, and when I finished speaking, she asked in a broad West Country accent, she said, "Well, what kind of language is that you're talking?" she said, aggressively. And I thought, oh God, here we go again. What should I say? And she instantly added, "Because I'd like to learn that language."